Well, tonight we continue our journey through the book of Ruth, and we're in the final chapter. We're going to look at verses 9 through 12, and we've divided the chapters into acts, and they kind of correspond with the chapters. So this is Act 4 or Chapter 4. It's called Redemption and Fullness. It's the opposite of Act 1, where everything fell apart, where Naomi loses everything. There's redemption for Naomi and for her family in Chapter 4. And in fact, there's more redemption down the line than she could even imagine. So God has a way of taking all of those bad things and turning them into something good. And we see the fulfillment of that here in Act 4. There's 3 scenes, and tonight we're going to finish scene number 1, and that involves Boaz, the other guardian redeemer, the witnesses that are there at the town gate, kind of acting as elders and judges. It does take place at the town gate, and that's where all the legal procedures for the town of Bethlehem would take place. And Boaz is going to redeem. In fact, we're going to hear his words tonight as he does that. And then after Christmas break, we'll get into scene 2, which involves Boaz, Ruth, Naomi, Obed, and the town women. And Naomi is going to dialogue with these town women, although Naomi doesn't have anything recorded that she says. All the words come from the town's women praising her and praising God for redeeming her life. And then finally, it ends with a genealogy. And I'll explain why it ends with a genealogy and why that genealogy is so important. Well, scene 1 is Boaz redeems at the town gate. There's 4 parts to that. One is Boaz's preparation for court. He finds the closer guardian redeemer at the town gate and invites the man to have a seat, and they're going to have a conversation. Then he gathers the 10 elders, probably those who are on duty that day to hear any legal cases, and he gathers them around as well. And we have the makings of an official court case that's about to take place. Then in verses 3 through 8, that is the court case, and it's really a dialogue between Boaz and the nearer guardian redeemer, as Boaz gives him the opportunity to redeem both the property of Elimelech and also the widow of Mahlon, Ruth, which the guardian redeemer says, yeah, I'd love to take over the property. He could make a lot of money doing that. But when it comes to marrying Ruth, he backs down. He somehow feels that will interfere with his family's inheritance, and so he basically says, no, I don't want to do this. You can do it if you want to. And that brings us to where we are tonight, and that's Boaz's reaction to the outcome. And then the people, the elders, and those who had gathered to hear this case, they're going to give their reaction as well. And their reaction may surprise you in some of the things that they talk about. So Boaz's response is where we're going to begin tonight. The other redeemer, the closer relative, the man who had the right of refusal, says no. And so he takes off his sandal and he hands it to Boaz, which, for us, that would be a really weird thing to do in a court of law, to take off your shoe and hand it to somebody. But in the ancient world, that was a way of saying, I'm turning down this opportunity and I'm going to turn it over to you. And so this man who's never named, the writer doesn't tell us what his name is. In fact, in many ways, in the Hebrew, it would be Mr. So-and-so. So Mr. So-and-so says no, and after he says no and gets rid of his sandal, he leaves the scene, he leaves the story. And maybe the writer doesn't include his name because of all the great things he potentially misses out on. And if they included his name, some of his relatives may have given him a hard time for his decision, but this way the man remains anonymous. He leaves the scene, which means that Boaz now has center stage. And Boaz has the opportunity to say to the elders and the people exactly what he intends to do. And what he intends to do involves 2 different institutions in the nation of Israel to preserve inheritance. We talked last week, land was very, very important to the Jewish people. And their promised land was divided into 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. So a tribe did not want to lose any of their land. And then the tribes were divided into clans. And each clan did not want to lose their land. And even then families, the family did not want to lose the land. And that's what the kinsman redeemer would do. Elimelech and his 2 sons have passed away, and there's no heir. There's nobody to hand the inheritance down to. So Boaz is willing to redeem it, and then when he marries Ruth, their child will then inherit the land. And so that way it stays in the family. And that was very important to the Jewish people. We also have this idea of levirate marriage. Naomi's husband dies. She has 2 sons. They die, and there's no son. So Boaz is willing to marry Ruth, and then that son would carry on the family line. So that way the name does not get erased or cut off from the people of Israel. So in verse 9, Boaz is going to talk about the property, and in verse 10, he's going to talk about Ruth. So as we begin in verse 9, Boaz begins by addressing the elders and the people. Now, the elders, that was the group of 10. These are the representatives of the people. These are the judges. These are the legal people. And Boaz wants to make sure that what he does is legal according to Israelite law, that nobody raises a red flag about what he's about to do. So these 10 elders will make sure that Boaz does things properly. And this is a small town, Bethlehem. In fact, we sang tonight, "Oh, little town of Bethlehem." It was little back in the story of the book of Ruth as well. So not a lot of people in the town, and there's this legal business going on, which probably that didn't happen every day. But now that we have something big going on involving Boaz, who's one of the leading landowners in the town, well, there's probably a lot of people gathered around eavesdropping. They want to know what Boaz is up to, how that could impact their town. So he addresses them as well. So he announces to the people that today you are witnesses. So these 10 elders are going to witness what Boaz wants to do. Now, keep in mind that this is basically an oral society. A lot of people back then did not know how to read or write. In fact, we're not even sure that these legal procedures that Boaz is going to go through will ever be written down. We're really not sure. So when you don't have a written document as proof, what do you have? I mean, what if somebody were to come along later and contest what Boaz does? Well, Boaz has a sandal as proof. He also has all of these witnesses as proof that what he did was legal. They witnessed it, they agreed to it, and therefore it can carry on. So that's part of the group of witnesses. They're going to say, yes, what Boaz is trying to do is legal, we'll let him do that. Or if there's a red flag, they're going to raise one. They're going to say, Boaz, you can't do that. And there's reasons why you can't. So they are witnesses in that sense. So again, to us, that sounds very strange. Because if we were to go out and buy some land or buy a house, there's all kinds of forms to fill out, You got to fill out all of these papers and, all these legal documents. And that would be your proof that you bought the house. Well, back in the ancient world, your proof was you've got a sandal and you've got some people who were there when you did it, who can tell your story for you. So that's the key to this whole thing. They are witnesses. He also goes on to say what he did. I've bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. Now, when Boaz was explaining this to the closer relative, he didn't mention all the property. He basically mentioned a field. And basically, he gave the broad scope of what was at stake. Will you be willing to redeem the property? But now that he's going to redeem it, he goes into detail. He's now going to redeem all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. So the entire estate will be handed over to Boaz, and also to Ruth after the two of them get married. Now, the mention of Elimelech and his two sons takes us all the way back to chapter 1. And that's where everything fell apart. That Elimelech decides there's a famine in Israel, we're going to Moab. And so they go to Moab. And they stay there, surprisingly, about 10 years. And during that time, his two sons marry Moabite women, and then the two sons pass away. So they've been gone from the nation of Israel, the tribe of Judah, and the town of Bethlehem for over 10 years. But now Naomi comes back. And now there's the need for somebody to redeem the family line. So it takes us all the way back to the problem, but Boaz is there to provide a resolution. He's there to provide a solution. So he begins with the property, and all the estate of Elimelech is now his. Then in verse 10, he goes from talking about the property to talking about Ruth. And it's interesting, he follows the same procedure with the other guardian redeemer. He first of all talked about the property, and the man said, yes, I'll redeem the property. Then he brings up Ruth. And then the man says, no, can't do it. So here in redeeming it himself, he again starts with the property. And now that the property issue's been settled, he goes on to talk about Ruth. And he mentions the fact, I have also acquired Ruth, the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife. And in the Hebrew, Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, are the first words in the sentence, and that's where the emphasis lies. Not only is he acquiring property, he's also going to acquire a wife. So this is where it goes from just property to being more intimate, to being more personal. He's not just going to have some property, he's going to have a wife now. Somebody who's going to move into his home. And it's also, given the fact that it's so intimate and personal, he uses an interesting word. A word that we would never use today. He says, I have acquired Ruth the Moabite. You know, now today you do acquire a piece of property, and that's proper language for that. But the groom doesn't say, I've acquired a wife. That would be, quite inappropriate in today's language. But back in the ancient times, maybe not so inappropriate. Remember when Boaz first met Ruth? Ruth went out early that morning to glean in a field, had no idea where she was going. She ends up in one of the fields that's owned by Boaz. And apparently the foreman gives her permission to go ahead and glean. And Boaz shows up a little bit later. And Boaz looks out and he sees this woman and he doesn't recognize her. And today, Boaz would say, who is that woman? But that's not the question he asked. He asked, who does that woman belong to? And in the ancient world, that was appropriate. Because for a little girl growing up in a home, or for a single woman, she belonged to her father. And once the woman gets married, she belongs to her husband. So in essence, Boaz is going to acquire Ruth. She's now going to belong to him. So things were a little different in the ancient world. But it's interesting that he uses that language to talk about acquiring Ruth. Now, in this procedure that he's going through, he's going to acquire Ruth as his wife. But they won't get married until verse 13. And we won't get to the marriage until January. We're going to make them wait. just a few more weeks. Now, it's also fascinating how Boaz refers to Ruth. And maybe he does this because he's following legal procedure. You get the impression that Boaz is being very careful. He's making sure he dots all the I's, crosses all the T's, that everything he does is according to the way it needs to be done, according to Israelite law. So he refers to Ruth as Ruth the Moabite. Now, Ruth and Boaz have known each other for quite some time now. When they first meet, Ruth does introduce herself as a foreign woman. But as time goes on, they get to know each other. And then there's that crazy night when Ruth shows up in Boaz's tent and uncovers his feet. So by this point, I think they're a little more casual, maybe a little more intimate. And we may have expected him to just say Ruth, and everybody would know who he's talking about. But he's very particular in saying Ruth the Moabite. And it could be that the mention of marrying a Moabite could have raised some eyebrows among the people of Israel. For many of the Israelites, the Moabites were an outside group, a group you don't want to marry, a group that's considered an enemy. There were times when the Israelites and Moabites were at war with one another. And also there were a couple of reasons why the Israelites looked down on the Moabites. And one is where the Moabites came from. And there's a very fascinating story, one that we don't always pay much attention to, in the book of Genesis. And it involves Lot's daughters. After Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed, Lot's daughters look at each other and say, "Where'd all the men go? Where will we ever find a husband? How can we have children?" And then Lot's daughters do something that's unthinkable, incredibly immoral. On 2 consecutive nights, they both get their father drunk, have sexual relations with him, and get pregnant. And Lot's oldest daughter gives birth to a son, and she names him Moab. So that's where the Moabites came from. You know, interesting story that you can tell at family reunions. You know, this is where our origins were. It's like, ugh, talk about skeletons in the closet. But we're going to find out before we finish tonight that the people of Judah have some skeletons in their own closet as well. You know, Jesus and the woman taken adultery says, any of you without sin, you start the stoning process. And smartly, they all dropped their rocks and went home. Perhaps we all have a few skeletons in the closet as we look back at our families. So those are some of the reasons that Israelites would not like Moabites. But Boaz points out in chapter 3, verse 11, that many of the leading citizens of Bethlehem have a high respect for Ruth. They honor her great character, especially how she's treated Naomi. So there could be some in Bethlehem thinking, "Oh, Boaz, can't you marry an Israelite girl? Do you really have to marry a Moabite?" And some of the others may be thinking, this is a very wonderful woman who's done great things for Naomi. She would make a wonderful wife for Boaz. So perhaps both are taking place. Then the second characteristic, she's Mahlon's widow. Now we learn all the way back in chapter 1 that Elimelech's 2 sons, Chilion and Mahlon, while they're in Moab, get married to Moabite women. And the names of the Moabite women are Orpah and Ruth. But what chapter 1 doesn't tell us is the boys, which girl did they marry? It never says. In fact, here in chapter 4 is the first time that we learn who Ruth was married to, that she was married to Mahlon, not Chilion, which obviously means that Orpah was married to Chilion. But this is the first time in the story that the author tells us who Ruth was originally married to. So it's kind of fascinating that he waits to the very end. It's also interesting that Boaz, again, is being very precise. In verse 3 of chapter 4, he refers to Naomi as Elimelech's widow. Now he refers to Ruth as Mahlon's widow. He's making sure he's got all of his ducks in order, that everything is correct in what he's saying. Then, after announcing the fact that he's going to marry Ruth, he tells us the significance of all of that, why that's so important. And he tells us both using positive words and also using negative words. He starts with the positive words. In order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Well, the property originally belonged to Elimelech, then the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and now, by marrying Ruth, their son, which if you've read ahead, they do have a son eventually, his name is Obed. He will inherit the property and keep the family name alive. So it goes from Elimelech to Mahlon to Obed. And the property stays in the family, in the clan, which is exactly what they were trying to accomplish. So it was important for Boaz that Mahlon's name stays remembered. It was interesting in the ancient world that you pass away, if you're a man, you leave your inheritance to your son, your firstborn son, and somehow that continues your line, which was very important, so that you could always be remembered as the father of that child. And as long as your name was remembered and spoken, especially at the town gate, it was almost as if you were still alive. But if the day comes when your name is no longer mentioned, that's a bad thing. Then your name gets kind of like erased or cut off. Your name disappears from the people. That's why it was so important to have the heir. Now, Boaz will state that negatively, so that his name will not disappear or be cut off from among his family or from his hometown. And so, in the Greek, it's kind of difficult to translate, but that first one is, it won't disappear from his family, from his brothers, from his clan. And they translate it from his family. And then it talks about his name will not be cut off from his hometown. Literally in the Hebrew it is, from the gate of his place, meaning the town gate of his place, of his town, which would be Bethlehem. So by marrying Ruth and by having a son who takes over the ownership of the property and is the heir, Mahlon's name will not disappear. It'll still be included in the family. However, it is interesting. When you read the genealogies, even the genealogy in the last part of the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verses 18 to 22, that the child, Obed, is identified as the son of Boaz, not the son of Mahlon, which technically he's supposed to be the son of Mahlon. But it doesn't say that. In fact, in 1 Chronicles, when the genealogy is listed, again, Obed is the son of Boaz, not the son of Mahlon. And in the New Testament, Gospel of Matthew, talking about Jesus' genealogy, again, it's Boaz, the father of Obed. So it's interesting that this name does sort of disappear. Mahlon's name is not mentioned outside the book of Ruth in none of the genealogy. So it's interesting how that works out. Well, now it's time for the public to give their response. Boaz has done a tremendous job of saying exactly what he wants to do, and it all fits with Israelite law, and he wants the people to be witnesses. And the first response that they make is, yes, we will be your witnesses, which means that what you did is legal, and we're willing to attest to it. So no red flags, everything is done correctly. Then they're going to pronounce a blessing upon Boaz. In fact, 3 blessings upon Boaz and his family. And they're going to go back and talk about some of the people who got the nation of Israel started, especially the 12 tribes. And in particular, they're going to talk about the tribe of Judah, because everyone who lives in Bethlehem, for the most part, is from the tribe of Judah. Bethlehem is located in the tribe of Judah territory. So they're going to go back and talk about something that happened to Judah, which is a rather fascinating story as we look at it. Well, let's begin in verse 11. And by the way, the blue, those are the 3 blessings. And it starts in English with the word may. May the Lord bless you. But the elders and the people at the gate says, we are witnesses. So they're on board. So now the whole town is on board in what Boaz wants to do. And so now that everybody's on board, it's time to pronounce blessings upon Boaz. You know, it's kind of like at a wedding when somebody stands up and kind of pronounces blessings upon the bride and the groom, even praying for their children. I remember at my wedding many years ago, my father-in-law got up and pronounced a blessing upon Cassie and I, including the children that we were going to have. And my eyes opened at that point. I wasn't ready to have any children at that point. It's like, whoa, we're just getting married. We're not ready for children. But God did bless us with 2 wonderful girls. But I wasn't ready at that moment. So the first blessing, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the family of Israel. Now, these are Jewish people living in Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah, in the nation of Israel. And it's interesting in this blessing that Ruth is not named. She's referred to as the woman. In fact, in another blessing, she's also going to be called the woman. And you got to be thinking, this woman has a name. And you know her name. In fact, you might even know her. Why are you referring to her as the woman? And maybe part of this blessing is kind of like a standard formula that they're using. And again, the understanding is Boaz, the male, the patriarchal society, is acquiring a woman, a wife. So maybe she doesn't get named for that reason. Not sure otherwise why her name would be left out. Now, it talks about the woman who's coming into your home. And there was this wonderful tradition back in the ancient world when they did a marriage celebration. In fact, normally the marriage celebration would last for an entire week, which, in today's standards, if it goes over a few hours, people get bored and leave. But, unless you're a good dancer, you can stay all night. But it lasts a whole week. And then at the very end, the wedding party, led by the groom, will march in procession to the groom's home. And once they reach the home of the groom will then welcome his bride into his house. So the bride has left her father's house. She's now included in her husband's house. So in this particular instance, Ruth is going to leave the home of Naomi. And now she's going to live in the home of Boaz. And that's really important because remember the end of chapter 2? At the end of chapter 2, Naomi and Ruth have all this food. And we know at that point they're not going to starve to death. Boaz is going to make sure they've got plenty of food. They're going to be well taken care of. We're not going to read about them dying of starvation. But there's a problem still. Ruth is living in the home of her mother-in-law. And that's how the writer puts it at the end of chapter 2. And the whole idea is Ruth should not be living in the home of her mother-in-law. Ruth should be living in the home of her husband, if she had one. And then, of course, in chapter 3, that's when Naomi comes up with this incredible scheme to get Ruth to basically propose to Boaz to be her husband. So now that's going to be fulfilled. And even in our own culture, we have this picture of the groom carrying his bride over the threshold. It all goes back to this tradition, that now the groom is formally ushering his bride into his house. And so that's exactly what's going to happen in verse 13. But then, after calling her the woman, which, in our society that's a little degrading, she gets compared to the matriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, who happened to be Rachel and Leah. You may remember the story. It's in the book of Genesis as well. Jacob ends up at Laban's home, and he meets one of Laban's daughters, Rachel, and he falls in love with her. A true love story in the book of Genesis. And he agrees to work for Laban for 7 years so that he can finally have Rachel as his wife. So he works for 7 years, and he was so in love, it's like time just flew by. But on the wedding night, Laban does the switcheroo. So instead of marrying Rachel, he ends up marrying Leah. And Leah is the older sister of Rachel. And so Laban says, Leah's got to get married first. And so Jacob's married to Leah. Then he works out another deal, that for 7 more years he'll work for Laban, and then he'll marry Rachel. And finally, he marries the love of his life. And they start a family. And at the beginning, Rachel is unable to bear children. But Leah is, kicking them out one after the other. And then both of these women, Rachel and Leah, have handmaids, which back in the ancient world, your husband could have sexual relations with your handmaid. Handmaid gets pregnant, and the child officially belongs to you, which is why the handmaids are not mentioned here. It's just Rachel and Leah. Well, when all is said and done, between Rachel, Leah, and the 2 handmaids, Jacob ends up with 12 sons. It's also interesting that Rachel eventually, God opens her womb, and she gives birth to Joseph and Benjamin, who happen to be Jacob's favorites, but that's another story. These 12 sons are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where it all got started. So, amazingly, Ruth, the woman, is being compared with Rachel and Leah. And just as Rachel and Leah got the nation of Israel started with the 12 tribes, may the woman you're marrying, Boaz, produce many children for you and establish your home. Another fascinating thing about this is Rachel is mentioned first, and then Leah. Well, Rachel was the favorite, but she wasn't the first wife, she was the second. And who was the mother of Judah? Leah. And so these people of Judah are actually putting Rachel before Leah, even though Leah would be the mother that they would look back to. Fascinating. So this is a prayer for children. that God would bless your family with many children. And of course, in the ancient world, the more the merrier in terms of children. Especially you had to have a son, because remember, it's the son who carries on the family name. And then there's another blessing. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. And this one's a little more difficult to translate. Literally it says, may you make power in Ephrathah and call a name in Bethlehem. And this figure of speech, to make power, is translated, may you have standing. And the standing could be wealth, but Boaz really has a lot of wealth already. It could also mean your total well-being and success. In other words, may God bless you in every area of your life. May you be successful in everything you do. That would be kind of the essence of that prayer. And then the second prayer is that you would call a name. And that word means to be influential, to be famous. And that's how the NIV translates it. May you be famous in Bethlehem. And that prayer gets answered. Because who comes from Boaz's family line, if you've looked ahead? David, the king. And guess who else comes from this family line? Jesus. So that prayer got answered in a huge way, in a way far beyond what they would have ever even understood. Incredible. We have Bethlehem and Ephrathah, and basically it refers to the same place. They're interchangeable. The mention of Ephrathah also recalls the place where Jacob was traveling to when Rachel dies. So maybe it was included because of that. Both names are mentioned in Ruth chapter 1, verse 2, and both names are mentioned in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And I'll mention that because it's very appropriate for the season of the year that we're in. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, indeed it was a small town, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. And really, there were two. One was David, the next was Jesus. But this is specifically talking about Jesus because whose origins are from old, from ancient times, would not have referred to David. It would have referred to Jesus. So the little town of Bethlehem is going to make history with David and even more importantly, with Jesus. Well, the last part of this blessing, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman. Her name's Ruth. Again, she's not named. She's now a young woman. May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So this is a blessing upon the household of Boaz. The clan of Perez gained a lot of prominence in the tribe of Judah. Because again, there was the tribe and then there was all of these clans. And it was the clan of Perez that was more prominent in Judah than any other. Boaz is from this clan. Most of the people living in Bethlehem were from this clan. Elimelech was from this clan. So the prayer is, just as Perez became distinguished among the people of Judah, may your household be distinguished among the people of Judah. May you continue in that line. So again, Boaz is going to perpetuate the line of Elimelech. The offspring of Boaz and Ruth will build up their house, build up their clan. It's interesting to ask the question, did Boaz have a family before he met Ruth? And we're not told. There's nothing in the text to say so. But it's interesting that in the genealogies, Boaz is mentioned as the father of Obed. If he had children before Obed, if he had a wife before Ruth, they're not mentioned. So it's kind of interesting how that worked out in history. And of course, this author tells us nothing about that. Well, there's an interesting story because they all belong to the clan of Perez. And this Perez is whom Tamar bore to Judah. There's a story in Genesis chapter 38. And this story is right in the middle of the Joseph story. So, for the most part, from chapter 36 on, it's the Joseph story. But you've got this story in chapter 38 that has nothing to do with Joseph. It's just kind of thrown in there. And as you're reading Joseph's story and you get to chapter 38, you're going, why is this in here? It's supposed to be about Joseph, but this is not about Joseph. And in fact, as you're reading, if you're teaching children about Joseph's story, you skip chapter 38 for two reasons. Number one, it has nothing to do with Joseph. And chapter 38, another reason is this is not a children's story. In fact, if you've ever read Genesis chapter 38, you probably blushed a couple of times and said, how did this ever get in the Bible? Why did Moses ever include this story? I mean, this is one he could have left out. Well, what's the story? Well, it's about Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, leader of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he gets married to a Canaanite woman named Shua. Should he have married a Canaanite woman? Probably not, but he did. And they have 3 sons. The first son is named E-R. The second son is named Onan. And the third son is named Shelah. So 3 sons, Onan, Shelah. And so Judah's very happy. He's got 3 sons. He's going to pass down the family line to the first one. So he tries to find a wife for And he finds one. Her name is Tamar. And she's a Canaanite. And they get married. And is so wicked, God puts him to death. And then Judah says to Tamar, okay, my firstborn son is dead, and according to the levirate marriage, now you have to marry the secondborn son, which is Onan. And she does marry him. But Onan's thinking, yeah, I'm going to marry this woman, I'm going to have a child, but it really won't be my child or my family line. It'll be the family line of my brother. And you can read for yourself what he does. And God gets mad at him, and he dies too. So now here's Judah. He's got 1 son left. But he's thinking, Tamar's bad luck. I don't want her to marry my youngest son. And so he basically says, you're just going to have to live as a single woman. And then Tamar decides to take matters into her own hands. She disguises herself as a prostitute. And she meets Judah in another city. And Judah propositions her, offers her property or animals, old-time money, for sexual favors. And it happens. And Tamar gets pregnant through Judah. So now we have a father-in-law having sexual relations with a daughter-in-law, and she gets pregnant. And she has twins. And it's an interesting story as the twins are coming out of the womb. It looks like Zerah is going to get there first, which means he would be the firstborn. He would be the heir. But Perez somehow goes around him and comes out first. and the midwife calls him Perez, or breach or break. Fascinating story. And did you know that Elimelech and Boaz are part of the clan of Perez? Imagine that story at the family reunion. So how did your family get its origin? Oh, we're from Judah. Oh, that's impressive. Tell me more. Well, Judah propositioned a prostitute who happened to have been his daughter-in-law, and she got impregnated and had twins, and the first one that came out is Perez, and he's our relative. I don't think the people of Bethlehem can throw stones at the people of Moab. Not after that story. And what's the conclusion? The conclusion is God can bless even when there's a mess. Because God did bless. Judah ended up with an heir, Perez and Zerah. And it's amazing, as people look at their own lives, often they think, God can't use me because, I'm a mess. Well, maybe we should say God can use you because you're a mess. Because God's been using messes from the beginning of time. And what's so amazing is that this story is told like it's a good story. We're from the clan of Perez. It's like we should be proud of that. But it's interesting, that's the line of Boaz. That's the line of King David. That's the line of King Jesus. It's in Matthew chapter 1. And Tamar is mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. Why didn't the gospel writer leave that one out? Moses wrote the story. It's remembered in the book of Ruth, and it gets brought up again in the New Testament. Jesus comes into a world of people who are a mess, and it doesn't bother him. He's not put off by it. He works with our mess. And what ends up at the end is a blessing. What an incredible story. So, the next time you think, God can't use me because I'm too messed up, remind yourself of who God used. Amazing, the grace of God and how that changes things. And we are encouraged now to invite Jesus into our mess. And he's okay with it. Jesus doesn't say, I'm not getting my hands dirty in that situation. No, Jesus climbs into our mess. And somehow he blesses something. And it turns out incredible. It's Christmas. The Savior's coming. He entered into a world of mess, and he turned it upside down. He can still do the same in people's lives today. So, don't be turned off by the mess, because God can use the mess to bless and do great things. Heavenly Father, what some incredible stories that we've looked at tonight. And Father, what a great reminder of your grace, your mercy, your love. Father, thank you that you're not turned off when we mess up. You're still our Heavenly Father. You still love us. You still care about us. And even in the midst of the messes that we make, you're able to redeem them. You're able to bless in a difficult situation to turn things around. Father, thank you that you're that kind of God. Thank you that we don't have to be perfect or almost perfect to come to you. we can come to you in absolute mess and find grace and mercy. And you're willing to welcome us, to give us a big hug, to throw your arms around us, and to help us through our mess. Thank you that you're that kind of God. Thank you for these stories that make us blush, stories that we would never want to tell our children, stories that we would be tempted to sweep under a rug and never bring up again, but yet they're recorded in Holy Scripture to remind us of the kind of God you are. So, Father, may we think about that, and may we understand a little bit more about you, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.